This is a video on how to replace an instrumentation bulb, also called a meter bulb, on a 2011 Ninja 250. This video includes right and left fairing removal and installation, radiator fairing removal and installation, upper fairing removal and installation, and meter bulb removal and installation. I would like to report a strange phenomenon that has been occurring with this Ninja 250. It seems that the speedometer cable has been causing the instrumentation bulbs to burn out. This has occurred only a couple of times in the last 4 years, but there seems to be a correlation between the bulbs and the cable. Speedometer cables often make a strange noise like a siren. About 3 years ago, I started hearing this noise while I was riding, and about 20 seconds later, after hearing the noise, 2 of the instrument bulbs burned out. I lubricated the top end of the cable with PJ Blue chain lube, and this seemed to solve the problem, although I don't necessarily recommend using this product for the speedometer cable. About 3 months ago, the same thing happened. The noise started, and about 20 seconds later, the fuel gauge light burned out. To avoid this type of thing, you might want to lubricate the top end of the speedometer cable. In this video, we'll demonstrate how to access and remove the top end of the cable. I don't believe it's possible to access the meter bulbs without removing the side fairings, radiator fairing, and upper fairing. We'll begin this video by removing the right fairing. In order to remove the right fairing, we must first remove the right side cover. There is 1 Phillips head screw and 3 stoppers inserted in grommets. Gently pull out the 3 stoppers one by one. There are 2 large hex bolts, one at the bottom of the bike and one at the middle of the bike. Keep your hardware in an organizer to prevent loss. This is a very inexpensive DeWalt organizer purchased at Home Depot. It is compact and has 2 halves, one used for the right fairing hardware and the other for the left fairing hardware. The dividers can be repositioned. Now we will remove the second large hex bolt located at the middle of the bike. Disconnect the turn signal by pushing on the very end of the tab on the connector. You may need to use quite a bit of downward force on the tab to separate the connectors. There are 2 smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. And there are 2 more hex bolts at the front of the bike, which are screwed into well nuts. The last hex bolt connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Be aware that this bolt can be somewhat finicky to remove. It has a tendency to get caught up on the radiator fairing once it is removed from its threads. keep track of the nut plate. Sometimes the nut plate will be clamped on tightly, other times it will fall off. This is what the nut plate looks like. The bolt screws in like so. If the plate does fall off, be sure to keep it in your organizer. There are 3 small rivets. To remove the side fairing, we'll have to remove only the lower 2. We'll remove the 3rd upper rivet later on, when we remove the radiator fairing. Disengage the rivets by pushing the button at the center with a pencil or some thin piece of plastic. Once the rivets are disengaged, they can easily be pulled out with fingernails. If you are interested in how these rivets work, here's a demonstration. The rivet is installed with the middle piece raised up. Notice that in this configuration the teeth are not flared out, and thus the rivet is not activated. After the rivet is installed, it is activated by pushing the middle piece inward like so. Notice that the teeth are flared out, which means the rivet is activated. To deactivate the rivet, the middle piece is pushed further in like so. Notice that the teeth are not flared out, which means the rivet has been deactivated. To reset the rivet, simply push the middle piece back out. Now the rivet is ready to be installed. Now we will remove the second rivet. Again, the 3rd rivet does not need to be removed until we remove the radiator fairing. There are 3 large rivets at the bottom of the fairings that hold the right and left fairings together. These rivets are designed differently from the small rivets. To remove them, use a flathead screwdriver to take out the inner part of the rivet, and then the remaining part will be easy to free from the hole in the fairings. If you are interested in how these rivets work, here's a demonstration. The rivet is installed with the middle piece removed. Notice that the teeth can easily be pushed inwards, which means that the rivet is deactivated. Once the primary piece is installed in the fairings, the inner piece is pushed into it. Notice that the teeth cannot be pushed inwards, which means that the rivet is activated. To deactivate the rivet, simply pull the middle piece out with a flathead screwdriver. Notice that the teeth can easily be pushed inward again, which means that the rivet is deactivated and can easily be removed. Here is the second large rivet. And the 3rd large rivet. When removing the fairing from the bike, you must keep track of 2 well nuts, 1 pad, and of course the nut plate mentioned previously. These are the 2 well nuts. The 2 hex bolts removed previously screw into them. They are black rubber with inner metal threading. If you're interested in how these well nuts work, Here's a diagram. The rubber has metal threading inside it that the bolts screw into. As the bolt rotates in the threads, the end of the well nut moves inward, flaring out the rubber and creating a tight seal on the surface. The pad is supposed to stick onto the fairing but typically falls off. This is where the pad is supposed to be located. You can see the sticker residue. And this is the pad. It protects the gas tank from friction against the fairing. This pad was left uninstalled for thousands of miles. You can see where the fairing has rubbed against the gas tank. Now we will remove the left fairing. Removal of the left fairing is pretty much the same as the right fairing, minus the 3 large rivets at the bottom that hold the 2 fairings together. To remove the left fairing, we must first remove the left side cover. There is 1 Phillips head screw and 3 stoppers inserted in grommets. Gently pull out the 3 stoppers one by one. There are 2 large hex bolts, one at the bottom of the bike and one at the middle of the bike. There are 2 smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. And 2 more hex bolts near the front of the bike. The last hex bolt connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Be aware that this bolt can be somewhat finicky to remove. It has a tendency to get caught up on the radiator fairing once it's removed from its threads. The nut plate on this fairing is loose, so it's best to take it off and put it in our organizer so it doesn't get lost. As with the right side fairing, there are 3 small rivets. To remove the side fairing, you will only need to remove the lower 2. The 3rd upper rivet connects the radiator fairing with the front fairing and is not necessary to remove until we remove the radiator fairing. Disengage the rivets by pushing the button at the center with a pencil or some thin piece of plastic. Once the rivets are disengaged, they can easily be pulled out with fingernails. Disconnect the turn signal by pushing on the very end of the tab. These wires are not easy to detach, so you may need to use quite a bit of downward force on the tab to separate the connectors. When removing the fairing from the bike, you must keep track of 2 well nuts, 1 pad, and of course the nut plate mentioned previously. These are the 2 well nuts. They are black rubber with inner metal threading. The pad is supposed to stick onto the fairing but typically falls off. Now we will remove the radiator fairing. There are two Phillips head bolts that connect the radiator fairing with the mounting bracket. There are two rivets that connect the radiator fairing with the upper fairing. First, deactivate the rivet by pushing in the center with a pencil or screwdriver. Then the rivet can easily be removed with fingernails. Then remove the radiator fairing by pulling it towards the rear of the bike and then down. Now we will remove the upper fairing. To remove the upper fairing, we must first remove the windshield because the two lower bolts that secure the shield join it with the upper fairing in a mounting bracket. Remove the four bolts that secure the windshield. Note that the two lower bolts are longer than the upper bolts. Each bolt has a nylon washer. Make sure that the two rubber well nuts that the top screws go into are not lost or damaged. They cost about $3 each to replace. The bottom screws have well nuts also, but the well nuts are seated on the mounting bracket and will not come up with the windshield. If you're interested in how these well nuts work, here's a diagram. The rubber has metal threading inside it that the bolts screw into. As the bolt rotates in the threads, the end of the well nut moves inward, flaring out the rubber and creating a tight seal on the surface. This tight seal dampens vibration of the windshield and prevents water from passing through. It's best to disconnect the headlights before we forget. As you can see, the back of the headlights can easily be accessed with the side fairings removed. There are two large hex bolts on either side of the bottom of the upper fairing. And there are two large hex bolts near the top of the fairing. The service manual says that you must remove these two bottom bolts also to remove the upper fairing, but on this model, it's not necessary to remove these two bottom bolts to remove the upper fairing. The bolts have large washers. We can now remove the upper fairing. Spread the sides of the fairing out a little so that they can clear the bolt holes and bracket holes. The rubber well nuts for the two lower windshield bolts are seated here. And here. This metal frame is where the two large hex bolts fit into at the top of the fairing. And these lower parts of the frame are where the two lower large hex bolts fit into. This is the back of the instrument cluster, the speedometer cable, and the headlight wires. You can access the meter bulbs from the back of the instrument cluster. Each of these round pieces of rubber is a socket for a meter bulb. One for the fuel gauge light, one for the engine warning light, one for the high beam indicator, one for the turn signal indicator, one for the speedometer light, one for the neutral indicator, one for the oil pressure warning light, and one for the tachometer light. On this bike, we need to replace the bulb for the fuel gauge light. Try to pull the socket out by the rubber tab and not by the wires. It's hard to get a hold of the tab because it's very small. Here's the bulb. The light should turn on when we flip the ignition switch. As you can see, the bulb is not working. Be aware that not all the meter bulbs will turn on when the ignition switch is flipped. Only 5 out of the 8 bulbs on this bike. The purpose for this is most likely to conserve battery life. To remove the bulb, pull it straight out. You should probably use gloves when doing this because if you squeeze too hard and the bulb breaks, you could cut yourself very badly. This is a 1.7 watt bulb. Here's the part number. When I ordered an OEM replacement from Partzilla, they sent me a 3.4 watt bulb, which is twice as powerful. I'm not sure which bulb is OEM, but I definitely prefer the more powerful bulb because it makes it a lot easier to see the gauges. Now we're going to install the new bulb. Be sure to test the bulb to make sure that it's working. As you can see, it's in operating condition. To reinstall the socket, gently push it back into the hole and make sure it's seated completely. If you want to lubricate the top end of the speedometer cable to possibly prevent other meter bulbs from burning out, simply screw the barrel nut off its threads and pull the cable out like so. There doesn't seem to be a lot of information about what type of lubricant is best for speedometer cables, or if it's even necessary to lubricate them, so decide for yourself. The service manual doesn't mention lubricating the cable, and the climber manual only mentions the cable briefly, saying to use a special lubricant formulated for speedometer cables. I found only one lubricant specially made for speedometer cables online, which seems to suggest that it isn't very important to lubricate speedometer cables because nobody bothers to make a lubricant, or they might make a lubricant but it simply doesn't sell very well. General purpose cable lubricants don't seem to state clearly that they can be applied to speedometer cables. So again, decide for yourself if you think it's necessary to lubricate the cable. We're now ready to install the removed parts. We will begin by installing the upper fairing. Make sure that this tab fits into its rectangular hole. The hole on this side of the bike was damaged, probably when the bike was backed into by one of 7 cars. Notice the other tabs too. Install the 2 large hex bolts at the bottom of the upper fairing. And install the 2 large hex bolts near the top of the fairing. These 2 bolts have washers. Connect the headlights. The upper fairing is now installed. Install the windshield. Be sure that the well nuts on the upper holes are not lost or damaged. They dampen vibration and prevent water from passing through. Be sure that the tip of the windshield is placed above this tab on the upper fairing. Not below the tab, as in this shot. Install the 4 bolts. The longer bolts should be installed in the bottom holes. Be gentle when installing these bolts. The well nuts can rip, and they cost about $3 each. If you hear a buzzing noise near the windshield while riding your bike, you may want to tighten the windshield bolts, but don't over-tighten. Now install the radiator fairing. The Phillips head bolts go into the holes on this bracket. Be sure that the radiator fairing is properly positioned before installing the rivets and bolts. Install the 2 rivets. As demonstrated previously, install the rivet with the centerpiece in the raised position. After the rivet has been installed, push the centerpiece in to activate the rivet. Install the 2 Phillips head bolts. The radiator fairing is now installed. We will now install the left fairing. Place the turn signal wire on the fairing tab so that you don't have to fish for the wire once the fairing is installed. Install the left fairing. Make sure that the bottom part of the fairing is positioned under the side stand. Make sure that the well nuts are positioned properly before installing the front part of the side fairing. Position the tabs near the handlebars so that they go into their slots. The upper tab on this motorcycle was snapped off. Make sure that the front fairing pieces fit properly onto the gas tank and under the fairing. Install the 2 large hex bolts. Install the two smaller hex bolts near the handlebars. Install the two smaller hex bolts near the front of the bike. Install the two lower rivets which connect the radiator fairing with the side fairing. Install the rivets in the open position. Then push the middle piece into place. Install the nut plate. Install the corresponding hex bolt which also connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. This bolt can be somewhat finicky to install. Connect the turn signals. The installation for the right fairing is the same as the installation for the left fairing, minus 3 large rivets which serve to hold the left and right fairings together. Place the turn signal wire on the fairing tab so that you don't have to fish for the wire once the fairing is installed. Install the right fairing. Make sure that the well nuts are positioned properly before installing the front part of the side fairing. This well nut is not installed properly. Position the two tabs near the handlebars so that they go into their slots. Make sure that the front fairing pieces fit properly onto the gas tank and under the fairing. Install the 2 large hex bolts. Install the 2 small hex bolts near the handlebars. Install the 2 small hex bolts near the front of the bike. Install the 2 lower rivets which connect the radiator fairings with the side fairing. Install the rivets with the middle pieces in the raised position. Then push the middle pieces into place. Install the nut plate. This nut plate is clamped on tightly and was not removed. Install the corresponding hex bolt which also connects the radiator fairing with the side fairing. This bolt can be somewhat finicky to install. Connect the turn signal wires. Install the 3 large rivets that connect the right and left fairings together. Install the rivets with the middle parts in the raised position, or completely removed. Then push the inner part of the rivets into place. And the second rivet. And the third rivet. Install the right side cover. Insert the 3 stoppers into their grommets. Each side cover has a Phillips head bolt. Install the bolt. Install the left side cover, insert the 3 stoppers into their grommets, and install the Phillips head bolt. This concludes meter bulb replacement on a 2011 Ninja 250.